At that time, a brilliant young graduate student, but within a few years he came to be a leader on the ELO board of directors. He is now a professor of English at the University of Maryland and associate director for MITH, Maryland Institute for Technology in the Humanities. MITH has been an innovator in archiving electronic work, including the incredible archive of Dina Larson's writing, down to the shower curtain where she first sketched out Marble Springs. An amazing artifact. Bill Bly too, with his stuff, yeah. So Matt is well known for his brilliant scholarly work on preservation, for his leadership in digital humanities, and for his insights on game theory, not to mention his almost superhuman mastery of detail. He published 2 new books this spring, Zones of Control, Perspectives on Wargaming from the MIT, an 800-page, speaking of detail, anthology with almost 70 contributors and over 100 illustrations, and co-edited with Pat Harrigan, and Track Changes, a literary history of word processing from Harvard Belknap. So let us welcome, as he says I'm allowed to call him, my buddy Matt.
Thank you, Margie. There's no capacity I would rather be here in than as a friend of the ELO. Could we have the lights all the way down, please, in the room? Thank you. We've all been there. You tell somebody you're headed off to Porto or Bergen or West Virginia, and they say, "You're going to the ELO conference. I thought they broke up years ago." Just the other day, I Facebooked this photo with the caption "rehearsing my ELO keynote," and got this reply. For those not in on the joke, the Electric Light Orchestra is a British pop group founded in 1970 by Jeff Lynne and Roy Wood, both formerly of The Move. Besides Don't Bring Me Down, ELO has given us such hits as Can't Get It Out of My Head, Livin' Thing, Mr. Blue Sky, and of course, Do Ya, as well as the soundtrack for the 1980 Olivia Newton-John film Xanadu. Oh, sorry, wrong Xanadu. Their signature sound relied on classical instruments and arrangements, leading to their association with the progressive rock movement, about which more in a moment. While groups like the Beatles were experimenting with similar sounds in a studio setting, ELO's aspiration was to duplicate the full orchestral experience live on stage, and in this they succeeded, going on to a solid 16-year run before disbanding, selling over 50 million records, and earning the dubious honor of having the most Billboard Top 100 hits of any band without a #1 single. In 2014, they reformed under Lynn's direction, Sans Wood and original drummer Bev Bevan, and in fact they're touring this very summer, and this past April they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So this is Danny Harrison during his induction speech describing the music you just heard, the first track on 1976's A New World Record. Quote, "It starts so quietly and I had it turned right up, and then the terrifying sound grew straight into that giant orchestral arrangement with that choir and Bev's drums and that laser guitar, all the time punctuated with terrifying aleatoric string spikes." Aleatoric string spikes. People of Elit, this is our starship. Jeff Lynne's biographer, and he has one, recounts how the ELO's name came about. The three members of the band were discussing the possibility of having a large light show along the lines of the one that Pink Floyd was also using. Roy Wood thought about the BBC Light Orchestra, light in this case describing the style of music. If they were to include a light show and they were also using electric instruments, why not call themselves the Electric Light Orchestra? The stage sets eventually grew to include enormous flying saucers, as well as lasers, fog machines, flash pods, and other futuristic effects. Both the Flaming Lips and Daft Punk are progeny who claim their lineage, so naturally I got to thinking, beyond the mere coincidence of the ELO name, are there in fact any useful comparisons to be drawn between electronic literature and progressive rock? Indulge me, please, I've come all this way and Twitter's already approved. Now, I'm not going to argue that electronic literature is progressive rock, and I'm certainly not exactly, and I'm certainly not going to argue that electronic literature should be more like progressive rock, quite the contrary. But I do want to explore whether the origins, aspirations, and eventual legacy of progressive rock can offer some cautionary lessons for electronic literature as it has often been constructed and construed. Given that prog rock is characterized by compositions that flout conventional song structures, coupled with an intense interest in technical virtuosity, technological experimentation, and unwavering seriousness of purpose, or what one critic terms conceptual density, prog rock is nerdy, spacey, earnest, and intellectual, and is by definition not danceable. Its lyrical reference range unabashedly from the English pastoral tradition to J.R.R. Tolkien and Robert Heinlein. If prog rock was ever cool, it was in the first half of the 1970s, when bands like The Soft Machine, Genesis, Jethro Tull, Yes, King Crimson, and ELP were at the height of their powers. And though the ELO favored stringed instruments, albeit amped up and lacquered in bright primary colors, other bands regarded Hammond organs, mellotron keyboards, mini-moog synthesizers, and even more exotic equipage like the theremin as an integral part of their identity. Not just electrified music then, but some of the first glimmerings of an authentically electronic aesthetic. Here, for example, is Genesis's keyboardist, Tony Banks, on the opening notes of the band's 1972 anthem, Watcher of the Skies. Quote, "It was an extraordinary sound," and that's Banks, whose hand you see. On the old Mellotron Mark II, there were these two chords that sounded really good on that instrument. There are some chords you can't play on that instrument because they'd be so out of tune. These chords created an incredible atmosphere. That's why it's just an incredible intro number. It never sounded so good on a later mellotron. Meanwhile, lead singer Peter Gabriel would stand bedecked in a cloak and mask, miming, searching the firmament with a telescope. We may cringe a little, but the power of these performances comes through even in the grainy footage, preserving them on YouTube. Imagine being 18 years old in Britain, raised on top of the pops, and then going out to the club and seeing and hearing this for the first time. Tell Tchaikovsky the news. Suddenly rock music wasn't just rebellious, it was serious, serious stuff. Serious stuff. It is in this register of affect, more than in thematic, demographic, or even technological considerations, that I would locate whatever overlap we're willing to grant between progressive rock and electronic literature. Recall aleatoric string studies. Recall Tony Banks on how he took advantage of certain irregularities in one specific model of the mellotron keyboard, and think of the way we exploit frictions of interface, resistances of metal, glitches of code. Recall Peter Gabriel searching the skies. Or else here is Jeff Lynne on the ethos of the other ELO. Quote, I could write horrible hit singles, I'm sure I could do it, but I like to get my teeth into something serious. I like something a bit deeper than pop cliches. So, though there are any number of exceptions, ELIT, I would maintain, has also historically largely been defined by its seriousness. And lest anyone think I'm fixating on Eastgate, I give you Grammatron.
Yeah.
Grammatron, of course, is Mark America's work, often lauded as the first novel-length work of electronic literature published on the web, and it appeared in 1997, so I'm sorry to the unknown.
Sunshine 69.
Before 95.
So perhaps not. In spring of 2000, as America notes in his online bio, Grammatron was selected as one of the first works of internet art ever to be included in the prestigious Whitney Biennial, so how's that for serious? There are many lenses through which to read Grammatron, and I won't belabor them here, but I'm struck by the New York Times' endorsement, which proclaims that, quote, Grammatron is grappling with the idea of spirituality in the electronic age. And the specific reference here is to the story's protagonist, one Abe Golan, described by Matthew Mirapol in the same New York Times piece as, quote, a legendary software wizard who developed an automatic writing program called Grammatron. Now, the golem from Jewish mythology is often hailed as the first cyborg, Domo Arigato, Mr. Roboto, but consider this passage, quote, it's like randomly accessing a dream apparatus composed of oozing language fractals that allow you to get in touch with that part of yourself that is mediumistic in its passing of the all-important love energy. This is presumably indicative of the work's spiritual dimensions as characterized by Mirapol, and while it's only one of several of America's authorial voicings, it's not hard to imagine it perhaps transposed to the falsetto vocal registers and transcendent lyricism of John Anderson, who also meant it when he sang about the sight of seeds of life with you. Like prog rock, critics have more than occasionally knocked electronic literature for its perceived pretentiousness, and like a yes nerd expounding on the interlayered arpeggios of Close to the Edge because you really just cannot hear it properly without headphones, ELIT has embraced its own difficulty, nowhere more brazenly so perhaps than in the coinages of Espinarset and what we might term the Ergodic school, besides whose mysteries the temples of Syrinx pale. Quote, if texton, this is just a representative sampling, if textons or traversal functions can be permanently added to the text, the user function is textonic. If all of the decisions a reader concerns about a text concern its meaning, then there is only one user function involved, here called interpretation. Welcome, my friends. Welcome to the cybertext machine. Meanwhile, in North America, hypertext theory coexisted with a messy mesh of post-structuralist precepts that found expression in critical writing that more than occasionally seemed to aspire to the kind of transcendence promised by Roger Dean's iconic Yes album art. Dave Sicarico, in an important essay called The Contour of a Contour, surveys the development of that trope in first-wave hypertext criticism, offering up passages like this from Michael Joyce. Previously stable horizons across my psychic landscape gave way to dizzying patterns of successive contours, each of which was most assuredly real, each of which did not last. Man. But contour was not only an obvious attempt at a Neo-Derridian coinage, like the hinge or the supplement, it also has its roots in the spatial fixations of much of this criticism as well. Influenced by the predominance of story space, as well as important early studies like story space co-developer Jay Bolter's 1991 writing space, the overwhelming impulse in North American hypertext criticism was to frame hypertext using spatial metaphors, of which contour was merely one. We also grooved on lexias and other-mindedness and the shadows of an informand. My own contributions to these efforts was a 3D VRML space I entitled Lucid Mapping. So, yes, with our writing spaces and our contours and our lexia to perplexia, Elit's back catalog is filled with tales from the topographic oceans. Okay, so we're having some fun, perhaps. But my argument isn't finally that electronic literature has merely been prog rock in disguise for all these years. For one thing, there are undoubtedly wider cultural frames we could put in place around both phenomena to account for whatever commonalities we may happen to discern, including generational and demographic ones. There is also at least one other striking difference between the Elit tradition and the prog rock pantheon. Prog rock, as innumerable commentators have noted, was music made by men and to a very large extent listened to by men and man-boys. Elit's heritage, by contrast, includes a preponderance of essential women authors, to say nothing of critics, scholars, editors, and archivists. At about the same time Mark America was deploying Grammatron, for example, Dina Larson was publishing samplers, subtitled 9 Vicious Little Hypertexts, at least as prescient a glimmering of things to come. M.D. Coverley's Califia is, generically speaking, I think, historical fiction, and like Dina's work, draws on deep reservoirs of Americana in ways that few prog bands, save perhaps Kansas, ever would. Judy Malloy's essential works like Uncle Roger and Its Nameless Penelope strike me as less prog than new wave. So, unlike prog, Elit is simply unimaginable without the contributions of these and numerous other women authors. Clearly, the comparison has limits. But a key question, it seems to me still, is what difficulty and seriousness have done for the intentional category and construct that is electronic literature. Above all, I would submit, and this I think follows Rita Rowley's thinking from yesterday, that these characteristics have served to gain Elit institutional purchase in academia, where difficulty and seriousness are, after all, our bread and butter, or as the kids say nowadays, our jam. This is not so far from what the music historian Jim DeRogatis says about prog rock in relation to the music establishment. Quote, what progressive rock really signifies is music that self-consciously tries to elevate rock and roll to high culture by embracing high cultural values. And then, speaking of the foundational influence of the Beatles, he adds this non-incidentally. Many musicians in the first wave of British psychedelia were upper middle class kids. Sgt. Pepper's convinced them they could make music that was just as serious as the art they had been studying before they tuned in, turned on, and dropped out. Now, add logged on to that litany, and we may have something. Devastatingly, the Rebecus then adds, quote, and maybe it would even be respectable enough to please mom and dad. With the word like respectable laid alongside of serious and difficult, we can begin to see the terms of the legitimation crisis that marked the reception of early electronic literature, say from the late 1980s through at least the early aughts. However heroic Eastgate's efforts, and they were genuinely heroic, commercial sales remained challenging. Hypertext fiction, or as it came to be called, ELIT, would have to find purchase institutionally in the Academy if it was to survive. And the Academy had much to give. Jobs for some fortunate few, but also publication outlets, grants, endowments, office space, conference facilities, graduate assistants, and much more. But it would also leave its imprint, and this is something Mark McGurl has documented in relation to the way writing programs served to institutionalize, in every sense of that word, poetry and fiction writing in American universities in the second half of the 20th century. In this regard, electronic literature is really just a footnote to the much wider phenomenon that he names the program era. The program in question being not source code, but the MFA. Nor does McGurl fail to remark on the centrality of Brown's MFA program, in particular for electronic literary practices, duly noting its great patron Robert Hoover and its most famous student Shelley Jackson. And put another way, the exceptionalism on which the electronic literature community has so often traded is in fact completely normative in this wider sociological and historical frame, from the inception of the workshop model at Iowa in 1936 to the present, when Chad Herbach publishes a hotly debated essay using the three-letter acronyms MFA versus NYC to delineate two cultures of writing in the contemporary United States. I don't have time to recapitulate Herbach's arguments in detail, but this should suffice to make clear on which side the ELO community falls. Quote, the MFA canon is a living canon, not just by definition. It is, after all, contemporary literature. But because the writers who constitute it are constant presences on the scene and active shapers of the canon's contents, they teach, they advise, they anthologize, they travel from program to read. Now, the mention of canons and anthologies is not incidental here either. These are indispensable instruments by which any movement seeks to define and perpetuate itself. Nearly a decade before the first volume of the electronic literature collection, excerpts from Afternoon and I Have Said Nothing appeared in the Norden Anthology of Postmodern American Fiction, right next to work by William Gibson, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, and Don DeLillo. Joyce and Douglas's work was positioned teleologically at the end of the technoculture section, itself the penultimate section of the anthology, and lauded as, quote, potentially the most striking exemplars of its themes. More remarkable, though, is the actual method of inclusion. Both works are excerpted as a series of print lexias spanning a few pages apiece. I Have Said Nothing is also represented by a screenshot, but then Norden hired a Java programmer to re-implement more substantial excerpts of both pieces for the web, even approximating the behavior of Afternoon's storied Garfields. But here's the kicker. Lest anybody actually stumble across these hypertexts and read them without, paying, they could only be accessed by using an individuated passcode that came pasted into the back of every book, and which was valid for only 12 months. Michael Berube, in his first book, Marginal Forces, Cultural Centers, gives us perhaps the best account of academic canon formation in the avant-garde. By way of studies of the contrasting receptions of the famously reclusive Thomas Pynchon and the long-neglected Black modernist poet Melvin Tolson, he reminds us that canons are never just one way. They are reciprocating constructs, and just as Elit benefited from its academic uptake, so too did the Academy gain legitimacy. Street cred, if you will, by demonstrating its awareness, its hipness to the new technologies, and what the Northern editors saw fit to call a, quote, potentially historic transformation of literature. At his plenary, at last year's conference in Victoria, Stuart Northrop, always ready with the right turn of phrase, said something that stuck with me. We specialize in surprises, he said, referring to the distinctive work of this community in the face of the multi-terabyte torrents of daily digital culture. But just as prog rock traded on its overweening seriousness of purpose, so too has Elit and its academic hosts more than occasionally relied on self-conscious experimentation as justification, and sometimes I would venture as perceived sufficient justification for inclusion in canons and institutions. Consider Stuart's comment and then consider Genesis's self-description of their project in a tour booklet from 1975, the year Peter Gabriel left the band because the writing was already on the wall for Prog. Quote, just when adventurous rock seemed forever moving backwards, Genesis began flirting with multimedia concepts, the group proclaimed. Arguably, by then, progressive rock had become, in the words of the Marxist music critic Bill Martin, the first popular avant-garde. Prog musicians saw themselves as an extension of 60s idealism and activism, not as a repudiation of it. And for that very reason, along with punk rock, it would be the record industry itself, the real subject of Pink Floyd's Welcome to the Machine, that would sign Prog's death warrant as pressures for commercial success and radio-friendly singles mitigated against 20-minute album tracks with titles like Tarkus and Siberian Plotshrew. Greg Lake of ELP fame would rage against the punks, claiming they were doing nothing the Who hadn't done a decade earlier. Is this dichotomy or dialectic the inevitable way forward for our community? What does punk Elit look like? Is it the twine scene, as Lyle Skane suggested here on Thursday? Is it Twitter bots? Is it the new weird, like John Boyce's stunning 17,776? Is it something else? What does top 40 Elit look like? 2 years ago in Bergen, Espen Arset, in what I understand to have been a contentious speech, suggested that the most important electronic literature nowadays was being written in games. I take this to be not a judgment about artistic merit, but rather a statement about reach and impact. He points to a game like Fallout Las Vegas, not to my knowledge a candidate for inclusion in the Northern Anthology anytime soon, and that it contains some 65,000 lines of prose. Interestingly, in my search for a suitable screenshot, I couldn't find one with any more text than this. Espen's remarks were polarizing, I suspect, because games themselves are polarizing, as witnessed by our own internecine squabbles in the latter-day parabole of ludology versus narrative. Nonetheless, the populism and commercialism that attends any mention of games in relation to Elit is also an opportunity to re-examine electronic literature outside of what we might call the progressive tradition, which in broad strokes is what I take Stuart to have had in mind with his remark about specializing in the surprising. For me, what matters is the continued growth and diversification, as well as critical understanding of Elit, not dependent on whatever contradictions or complications attended status in relation to the academic avant-garde. And there are encouraging signs, I think, that such a re-examination is now well underway. I think about Sandy Baldwin's recent book, The Internet Unconscious, honored by this community, which seeks out, quote, a different kind of electronic literature, one not instantiated in works and authors, but rather in what Sandy terms the apparatus of all networked digital writing. Sandy proceeds from the simple but profound truth that everything on the net is writing, not only text, but also code, protocols, metadata, and more. Rita Rowley's ongoing work on what she yesterday termed machine writing further inflects, I think, the richness of that terrain. Sandy and Rita's investigations in turn align with what Danny Snelson and James Hodges have recently termed the study of ordinary media, everyday quotidian applications of electronic writing, an impulse that also informs my own work on the literary history of word processing, so WordStar, and desktop publishing. What does it mean, then, to think about Charles Bukowski as an e-lit writer? And this of course is a crumb cartoon, Bukowski's stance toward the Macintosh he got for Christmas in 1990 was as ordinary as you could imagine. He used it for email and MacWrite. But he was also enamored of it, and the following year his output of poems doubled. When a secretary, poet named Patricia Fried Ackerman sat down in front of the Wang word processor in her San Francisco office tower and composed a poem entitled "A Poem Written at Work on a Wang word processor" sometime in the afternoon wanting to leave, was she composing electronic literature? Or Gabe Porter, who used an IBM Series 6 in the late 1970s to publish a best-selling novel, The Midwife, in 1981. Porter has testified that the mere fact of the word processor allowed her to complete the novel, something she otherwise couldn't have contemplated given childcare responsibilities and the demands of a family business. If electronic literature is literature that could not be written without a computer, doesn't that make The Midwife e-lit in the most literal sense? What about the Barbadian poet Kamal Brathwaite, who used his Macintosh to design his own fonts and layouts for his books, yielding what Alex Pasquale might term printed e-lit and Jessica Pressman bookishness? Much of what I'm trying to suggest here can also be approached through the maintainers framework that has recently emerged in technology studies and the history of computing. Conceived as an explicit response to Walter Isaacson and other big budget narratives of innovation, like well-meaning but ham-handed films like The Imitation Game, the remit of the maintainers, as put forward by Andrew Russell, Lee Binsell, and others, invites attention to unappreciated and undervalued forms of technological labor carried out, quote, by those who repair and maintain technologies that already exist or that were innovated a long time ago, or as they also have it in their faux subtitle to the Isaacson book, How a Group of Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Made Technologies That Work Most of the Time. I would place innovation in roughly the same register as the experimental excesses of prog rock and the search for surprise that has marked e-lit as a literary and technological practice. What then does uninnovating, unsurprising, and woefully non-progressive electronic literature look like? In fact, and to its credit, I think this community has been fostering a culture of maintenance and repair for some time now. And here I will point to Nick Montfort's multiple instances of re-implementing classic works of computational literature, some dating back to the 1950s for today's platforms and environments, to the kind of documentary preservation pioneered by Deanie Bregard and Stuart Malthrop, the exhibitions led again by Deanie and also Kathy Inman Behrens, the often quite literally reparative and regenerative work undertaken by Laurie Emerson and other media archaeologists, and of course the curatorial and editorial labors that have attended the production of all 3 volumes of the ELC. This is in fact a remarkable body of work, and one of the places one that places members of our community in conversation with neighboring fields like library and information science, comparative media studies, and textual scholarship. These are important disciplinary allies, no less so than creative writing and literary theory variously were at other points in e-lit's institutional trajectory. Are there moments then in Elit's history that can be aligned with the ethos and idealism and, yes, excess of progressive rock? I think so, though exactly how much to make of them is not a question I really want to force here today. Rather, I've tried to lay out some trajectories for the future of Elit that eschew narratives of innovation, experimentalism, and the avant-garde, but which instead are more focused on platforms, apparatus, and infrastructure than on individual authors and savants. The ordinary, the everyday, and the ubiquitous, as opposed to the exceptional, and which are at least as quietly restorative as they are boldly and symphonically progressive. Computers, after all, don't have to be kinetic, interactive, multimodal, nonlinear, stochastic, or aleatory. Certainly not from where the end user sits, but we do associate them with such in order to validate certain figurations of artistic form, which we sometimes celebrate as electronic literature. Though exceptions may abound, this kind of media essentialism has been electronic literature's primary purchase on the literary canon, as an example such as the Norden shows. This may be why we don't typically talk about Michael Joyce as an Irish-American writer, for example, or Dina Larson as a writer of the American West, or Infocom titles as young adult literature, or Kamel Rathway as electronic literature. Now, innovation has an edge that I would never want to adjure. In his recent book on progressive rock, David Weigel offers a vignette that has guitarist Alan Holdsworth wiring together a trio of amplifiers with a soldering iron, trying to coax just the right tone from the cabinets, quote, their guts spilling out onto the stage right up until the very moment the audience walked in. No doubt the result was something startling. Likewise, our community can conjure with its own versions of these moments, whether in the fine-tuning of the barred fields of a story space hypertext, or the finessing of an action script or a JavaScript, or soldering the wires and traces of the salt immortal sea. The weaver and the web that he made. But nowadays, superimposed over that imagery, we can also see a teen threading a twine game, or an undergraduate using Kate Compton's tracery to piece together their first cheap bot done quick, or a walk-in at an open house at the Media Archaeology Lab, sitting down in front of a vintage Apple or Commodore to type 10 print for the first time, or merely the first time in decades. The weaver and the web that she made, the weaver and the web that they made. Because all of us already know that electronic literature is not a medium and not a genre, electronic literature, like the ELO, is a living thing. And for being our ELO pros. All of the staff and students and interns who worked at the conference. And of course, Ruby Torres and Sandy Baldwin.